In this tutorial, I will be going over how to create a box plot in Excel. First, I want to talk about when you would use a box plot. We would use a box plot in Excel if we were asking a question where the independent variable is categorical, or in other words, is qualitative data. A good example of that for our data set would be a question like this. Does deer browsing intensity affect CO2 fluxes in oak maple forests? In this case, deer intensity is measured as a treatment of being in an exclosure or outside of an exclosure. So we have categorical information and we want to know if the data inside is different than the data outside for CO2 fluxes. Now, another thing that we need to consider is that I've specified that I want to know about this effect in the oak maple forests. Note that I have both hemlock and oak maple forests, and so I'm going to have to remove the hemlock forest before I can actually do this analysis, or I'd be including data that I don't want to include. Essentially, I'm controlling for forest type. So in order to do that, it's a little bit of an extra step. You could organize your data and just remove the hemlocks. But for now, I'm going to do it a little in a simpler way. I'm going to highlight all of my columns and I'm going to go over to the Home tab and go to my Sort or Filter button, and I'm going to press Filter. That gives me a drop-down menu for each of these columns. And so I'm going to go onto the forest column and I'm going to remove the hemlock data. Now I'm left only with the data for the oak maple stands, not for the hemlock. So I've constrained my sample that I'm going to be comparing, right, for the deer intensity inside and outside the exclosure. Now, you might think that it might be easy enough to create this box plot to highlight the two columns. In fact, when you tend to do that, a lot of times Excel will not give you the correct categories or break up your data. It's going to try to do it, but it won't know exactly how to do that. So I'll do it. So I go into Insert tab and I'm going to go to this histogram looking icon and I'm going to go down to the box and whisker plot, or also called the box plot. In this case, it looks like maybe it did select the correct data for me and plotted it the way I wanted, the exclosures versus the no exclosure areas. But it doesn't always turn out that way, and the best way to deal with that is to right-click on your graph, go into the Format Plot, go into the Select Data, and you can actually remove this data. So let me just go ahead and remove it. And that cleans up my plot and it's a blank plot. Now I can go back into that select data and I can add my series. Right? My Y values here are going to be the mean CO2 values. And my horizontal or my Y categories are going to be my treatments, my exclosure and no exclosures. And that's really all I need. I could put a title on it, although I don't need a title. So I'm going to press OK. And we get about the same graph. It is very common that you might highlight these and it won't give you the correct graph. So you want to be very careful to always check, go right click and go into Select Data and look at what it's actually plotting. And you have your box plot. So in order to organize this a little bit better in terms of formatting, we can do a few things. We will remove our grid lines and we will always remove our chart title. We will add a box. So I'm going to click on the inside and I'm going to go to the Format Plot. That will bring up this box on the right-hand side. And I want a border essentially. I'm also going to put some tick marks on both axes instead of the grid lines, and I'm going to put, instead of it being gray down here, I'm going to put a black line over there as well. and you will find the tick lines. It depends on which version of Excel you have and which kind of programming you have, if it's PC or Mac, but I'm just going to go ahead and add these inside, and you can't see them because I need to turn this line to black. Another thing that we're going to want to do in this formatting is that we're going to actually want to be able to see what's in the box plot. Be very careful. If you use R, for example, the whiskers and the line might represent different things. So you must go and go search Excel, box and whisker, and get the information on what this bar, what this line means, or what the X means, or what the whiskers mean. And so I'm actually going to go ahead to fill, and I'm going to make this a little bit lighter so we can actually see that there are data points in here. There's an X for the mean, there is a line for the median, and you just want to get familiar with that information. Okay. Another thing we want to do is we want to go ahead and make these, I will put them at 12-point font at least. It's the smallest you want them. And then finally I'm going to go ahead up to the chart design. I'm clicked on the chart, so this will show up, and I'm going to add a title to my x-axis as well as my y-axis. Both of those will be one step higher in terms of font, so they will be 14-point font. Right, and then we want to be very descriptive here. This is not the most descriptive, but it's what I can think of. And then we have CO2, flux, rate. I would have to give you these units so that you could write this in here. You always want to add your units. It is micromoles of carbon per meter squared. That's why it's a negative, because it's on the denominator. I'm going to go into font. I'm selecting it, going into font, and I'm going to put a superscript. I'm going to do the same for seconds, per second. And I'm going to put the subscript for CO2. It's very important that we keep these things consistent, because if everybody makes their own graph the way they'd like to, it makes it very hard for the reader to go through and follow the papers if they're not all consistent. So it's actually very important to make fairly standard graphs that people can quickly identify as such. Now that is your box plot. Another thing you might want to do is you might want to have, because we don't have two different variables here, we could break this up, right? We could have month as well. So for each month, we could have our exclosures and our non-exclosures. So we could have multiple box plots, each one for a different month for inside the exclosure and outside. In that case, we would have two variables essentially denoted on our x-axis, and the easiest way to do that is to use color. So you would have three different colors for the three different months for both inside and outside the exclosure. So you'd end up having 6 plots overall. Again, to do that, you can easily do that by going in, selecting the data, and instead of having just them all in one series, you can have a series for August, right? So you could just essentially highlight your August data, and then you could add another series for your July data, and so forth. If you get into that situation, we can talk about that later in the semester if you're having problems. Otherwise, this is your common box plot for data where you have categories that you want to compare to one another.